Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer. Here's an unfortunate issue that has been coming up recently, and it will come up more and more in the future. So let's become familiar with this scenario and what the proper and improper handling of it is. Here's the scenario. Buyer has signed more than one buyer brokerage services agreement, both of which happen to be triggered by buyer's purchase of a piece of property. Said differently, we have two real estate brokers. Let's just assume they're even in two different firms, both of whom should be entitled to compensation because one buyer is purchasing a piece of property. And that buyer writes the offer utilizing the services of one of these brokers, but not the other. Nevertheless, the terms of the buyer agency agreement are broad enough that this broker is entitled to compensation based on the terms of the agreement. Assume that those are the facts. Now, this transaction that the buyer broker wrote for the buyer is in escrow and on its way to closing. Broker over here, you have no claim to this commission. Whatever the commission arrangement is in this transaction, if seller is paying the buyer broker compensation, if buyer is bringing funds to the closing table to pay their buyer broker compensation, it's happening within the terms of this existing transaction. Broker over here, you don't have a role in this transaction. And to the extent you inject yourself in this transaction or make a pest of yourself to escrow and to the other brokers, you risk putting yourself in jeopardy of a legal claim called tortious interference with a contract or with a business expectancy of the buyer and seller and the brokers who are involved in this transaction. Don't do that. You do have a claim, and your claim is against the buyer who signed the buyer brokerage services agreement with you, who is now in breach of contract. The escrow company who's closing this transaction should ignore you. They should tell you, we don't want to hear from you, which is hard for an escrow officer to do because escrow officers don't want to make enemies of real estate brokers. And you might even be somebody who brings a lot of business to this escrow company. The escrow company is not allowed to consider your claim to compensation. And if they do, then they will be in breach of their fiduciary duties to the buyer and the seller in this transaction who have entrusted them to close their transaction according to the terms of agreement. Terms of agreement between this buyer and the seller do not involve you. So hold your fire. Go talk to your own lawyer, talk to your managing broker, and decide if you want to bring a claim, file a lawsuit against the buyer based on your buyer brokerage services agreement that was breached by the buyer. You would have that right to bring that lawsuit if that's what your managing broker and legal counsel advise is the best approach. But what you don't have the right to do is interfere in the closing of that transaction between the buyer and the seller where you are not identified as a broker in the transaction. If you have questions on this topic or any other, ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org and following the links to the legal hotline. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.